Hey guys, so today we're going to learn how to start off with some cross stitch. So first you're going to need a needle. Here's the needle that I am using. For cross stitch you want to find a needle that has a relatively large eye and is blunt on the end so it doesn't hurt you too bad when you poke yourself with it. And then I'm also going to be using a hoop today since we're not going to be doing very much. This is only a 4-inch hoop, which is pretty small, but we don't really need much bigger than that. I also have some embroidery floss with me, so they normally come in a little thing like this. So I actually have some that's already on a little paper here. Sometimes it can be difficult to get the floss out of these little things that come like this, how you buy them in the store. And so you can get these little papers, they look like that when they're empty, and you just wrap your floss around it, and then when you're ready you just put the end in here so you can always find the end of your floss. So those are really nice, and that's how I make sure I don't lose the end of my thread. So we're not going to use a super long piece. Depending on how you like to embroider or cross stitch, the length of the thread changes. So I like to use a relatively long piece, but that's only because I do not like to have to go back and, re-thread my needle very often. So I'm going to use like 1.5 feet. I know it's difficult to tell on there. But we'll cut that. And I'm going to show you the several different ways to start and stop a cross stitch stitch. So let's first so we're going to put the hoop on. So in order to get the hoop out from how you have it, you're going to just push that bottom layer in, and notice that it will slide together, so make sure that you pull it apart when you put it back on, or else it'll be difficult to get on. So we're going to put this side underneath the fabric here and press the fabric so you see where the hoop is on the inside there. And then we're going to put this on, so just pull it apart and press it down. If you have a very new fabric, it might be more difficult. So that's what's going on here, because this fabric is very stiff. So, but there we go. And then we're gonna just make sure we get it all the way on there. Pull the fabric like that. I'm gonna loosen this even further. Alright, so now that is nice and tight. You see it makes a good noise when you hit on it, and it doesn't move too much. If you want, you can, pull it as tight as you can, but don't break your fabric, obviously, that would be bad. So now we're going to tighten it back up. Okay, so there is that. So now let's use our thread. So for the first method that we're going to do, we want 2 threads. So I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you look here, this is actually several different strands. So we use a 6-strand embroidery floss. So what you're going to want to do is find 2 strands. So there's 2 strands there, right? So I got 2 and 4. And I'm just going to separate the 2 of them. So one of the things that can happen while you're doing this is it'll get twisted around itself. So it's important that you hold all 3 sides. So I have found that one of the easiest way to do it is to hold one of the sides in your mouth while you're doing it, since we don't have 3 hands, obviously. But it can be done just by pulling on it. It just makes it a little bit annoying because it'll get twisted. One of the other things with using a longer piece is it is harder to separate. I have found that it's worth it, but a lot of people do prefer to use shorter pieces. So you can, of course, do that. I know lots of people end up using pieces that are no longer than like a foot. So, alright. So now we have our thread here, and we're going to thread our needle. So I'm just going to get the end of that a little wet so it's nice and pointy, so we're just going to put it there we go. Okay, so now we're going to start our stitch. So what we're going to do here is, if you see, I have the two ends are not even, so I have one side is about halfway down the full thread, so we're going to go, this is going to be our front side, so we're going to go in starting on the other side. We'll start over here, and so you're going to come in and don't pull it all the way through, and then you're going to go back in that cross stitch X pattern, so you're going to come in here and then pull it through. So now what you're going to do is you're going to leave about an inch. Once you get more comfortable with it, you can leave a little bit less too, but we're going to leave about an inch for this time. And you're just going to pin that down by crossing over it. So you're going to come over this way into that hole there and come back out on your front side. And then go back in and make your X. And then we're gonna go down. So let's go in here. And then come in here. And then make sure you cross it, so make sure you guys can see that. So there's your little tail there, and this is the hole we just came out of, so we're going to cross over here and go in through this hole here to make sure that we pin that little tail down. So now we're just going to finish up a couple stitches here, and just make sure that we have that completely pinned down. Okay, so now that I am satisfied with how much I have covered it and I've sewn as much as I want to for what I'm doing, I can end my stitch. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your needle and you're going to go through the back side of several stitches. So we're just going to go like this. So now that is nice and secure in there, so what we're going to do is just clip off the end. And cut it back as close as you can to the surface there, just to make sure. That your back is nice and neat, so when you're finished, you have a nice, neat back to this. Okay. So that is one way of starting and one way of stopping. So now I'm actually going to use this same piece of thread for the next one. So I'm going to take it off the needle and I'm going to separate it into two pieces. So if you were starting with a fresh piece of thread, you would just use one of the strands, but since we're just going to use this piece, we'll just separate it into two, and then we'll have our one strand we need. So the next method, you're going to take both ends of this one strand and put them together. There we go. Now, just like last time, I'm not going to put it halfway through, so I'm going to leave a short end and then a long end. And this method actually saves the most amount of thread, so you're not going to waste any thread while you're sewing. So just like last time, we're going to go in on the back side. So we'll go in right here, and you're not going to pull the fabric all the way through, or the thread. You're going to leave some of it, so we'll leave that much, and then come back in with our normal cross. So now as you come back through, you're going to loop this through. So you're going to put your needle through that loop that you've just made, and then pull that tight. Then you make a little knot. It's basically a slip knot there, and then you're not going to waste any fabric. And then we can continue with our X's. Now, when you do it this way, you have to be careful while you're sewing. So when we go in, when you pull out, you don't want to just pull with a ton of force. Hold the end there so that that little tail can't come off, and then you can pull with as much force as you feel you need. And then we can go back in again. Alright, so now we are done, and we're actually going to do the same method as last time to end the stitch. So you're just going to slide your needle through several of the stitches that you did, making sure not to go through the fabric. This method can be a little bit harder when you're using a smaller hoop, just because your needle will hit the edge of the hoop. So we're just going to do that and pull that thread through nice and tight, and then we're going to trim off that excess thread. So this method, both the starting and the stopping for this method, this second method, save the most thread. So you're not wasting any thread when you start your stitch, and you're wasting very little when you end your stitch, and the back side is going to be not very raised from the surface, which is nice. So the last method is easy, but it wastes a little bit more thread, and unlike the other ones, these ones, if you really needed to, you could take those threads out. Nothing there is permanent, and you could still reuse all of that thread if you wanted to. This one is a little bit more permanent. You'd have to cut the thread in order to be able to change it. So what we're going to do is take this last piece of thread, and we're just going to insert one side into the needle. There we go. So insert one side of this into the needle, pull it through, and this time we are actually going to pull it so that they're even. So we're going to put the two ends, once you have it through, put the two ends together, and get your needle right to the center. So we're just going to tie a knot in the end of this, so loop it around your finger, and then use your thumb and finger to pull it all together. And then take that end there and pull it, and then just pull the whole knot Okay, so now we have a little knot. So I'm actually going to tie a secondary knot because this 14 count Ida is a little bit wider, so that knot could theoretically make it through. So there we go. Now we got a nice knot on the end of our fabric there. So we're going to do the same thing we've been doing and just start our stitch on the back of the fabric. So I'm just going to go in and start making crosses. And one of the nice parts about this stitch is that you can just pull as hard as you want. It's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to come anywhere, so that is nice. The one problem is if you have to do a lot of stitching where you're going to have to go into that hole a lot, the knot is in your way. It is totally doable, but it can make it a little bit more frustrating. And so you're just going to so we're getting close to the end of this thread here. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned for you guys. So a lot of people are of the opinion that it really matters which direction you start and stop from. So I know it's not super easy to tell on here, but if you're not using a really shiny fabric or thread, it doesn't really matter if you go the same direction on each one every time. So if you're doing a really large piece and you end up, mixing up a couple of them, it's not the end of the world. And so don't worry too much about that. I have not been keeping, they're not all uniform through here and it looks fine. So it's important to know that if you make little mistakes or if you don't have them all facing the exact same way, it will look fine in your overall product. And you, especially if you're not using like a really shiny glimmery fabric or thread, you won't be able to tell. So, and just to make sure, so when you're doing your thread on the front side, you always want to go diagonal. When you're just going, there are other types of, when you're doing like a border, you can go just for a single straight. I'm not going to do one of those here because you wouldn't be able to see it on this fabric with the other thread there. So, but you can go just a single line if you're going around a piece. But if you're trying to fill in your design, make sure you're going in little, going only diagonally on the front. Some patterns will call for single diagonal threads like that one I just did. That's usually if you have two different colors that are back to back. The way I've used that the most is for shadows. So if you want to do like a white something that has a little bit of shadow, you could do stitches like this where one of them is gray and one of them is white, and that'll really help to get that shadow effect going on. And then on the back side, make sure that you do straight stitches every time. So like this one, I'm going to go straight there, and then that'll just make sure that I come out where I want to be. Try not to skip stitches. So like if I had gone straight the other direction, I would have to go back down there later to do the other cross stitch on this one if I am doing another cross on that one. So just make sure that you're going diagonal on the front and straight on the back. So the way to tell with this kind of stitch, so I'm going to do a knot on the back side too. You have to use more thread in doing this one than for the other two. So if you notice, I did a full stripe on the other two, but I didn't do a full one on this one. I could probably do 2 more X's and still have enough, but it sometimes gets really hard to knot it. So I'm just going to show you guys now. So what you're going to do is loop it around your finger, and you're just going to take your needle and thread it through. And so you're going to hold your finger, make sure you get both pieces of fabric. So you want the thread that's coming out of the needle and the thread that's coming out of the fabric to be held underneath your nail like that. And you're going to pull. And then that'll give you a knot that's really close to the surface there. So that's what you want. You want to make sure that your knot is as close as you can get to the fabric, and that'll make sure that the other pieces don't loosen. So we're going to do that one more time, get a good double knot. So I've threaded this through, and you see that point there. I'm just going to put my fingernail on that and then pull it out. Don't do this too fast, or you might it might escape from underneath your fingernail. But now what we're going to do is clip it nice and close. So here are the 3 different types of starting a stitch and the 2 different types of ending a stitch. So as you can see, this middle one has the least amount of waste. The third one and the first one have similar amounts of wasted thread. The difference being that you have to have this extra bit of thread on the needle when you tie, when you're done tying. So like at the end of the stitch, you have a lot more waste for this one, which can be frustrating, and then this thread is then useless to you. So I would suggest, if you can, use this middle one, but the other ones definitely have their places. So one of the nice things about these first 2 different kinds of threading is you can undo them. So let's say, for instance, that this first one here, that I meant to do it in blue. Alright, I meant to do a different color there, and I realized, oh man, I just did a whole line that's completely wrong. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to undo that. So you're going to find where you... So there was the beginning of my stitch, right? So, or the end of the stitch. And it's tedious, but what you're going to do is just unstitch it. So you just take your needle, pull that a little closer, and you just pull out the threads. And it's easier from the front, because when you look close, it's easy to tell which thread happened first. And there we go. So, it didn't take that long, right? It only took me like 4 minutes or so. So that is one of the really nice features about this first thread that we did and the second one there, because you can unstitch both of those pretty easily, which is really great if you have accidentally put it in the wrong spot. So when you're looking at your pattern, you know, you've done a bunch of various stitches, and then you look back and realize, oh no, I put a stitch in the wrong spot. Using that first stitch we learned and the second stitch that we learned make it way easier to unstitch and redo it somewhere else. So that is a really nice thing about those first ones, and is really difficult to do with the second one, because with that first one, now this thread is completely usable again. I could use this exact same piece of thread and do the exact same number of stitches that I did before in, you know, say I wanted it one spot over. I can now do that with this same piece of thread. But if I wanted to get rid of this third one, I would have to cut at this knot or I'd have to cut it at least 1 knot, and then the piece of thread would be much shorter than the one that I used before, since I did have some wasted thread the first time. So yeah, so that is how to start and stop stitches in cross stitch. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.